friends, welcome back to the Turf Shack. Welcome to episode 82 of Color and Emotion and installment number 3 of books that I've read in recent years as I have been in what I have personally termed Montessori graduate school. What I mean by that is not like some actual program to learn how to be a Montessori teacher. I just mean what I thought was self-directed study and just reading out of interest, out of inquiry. I am now realizing the past few weeks really how the Lord has been very strategic and purposeful in what he sort of had me gravitate towards and the different experiences and opportunities that have come up in the past few years and how it's all been packaged in a way that is not unlike a graduate school program. So anyway, today I am mostly going to be talking about How to Inhabit Time by James K.A. Smith. And like I mentioned before, I like book jackets, but I don't tend to read the book with the jacket on. But similar to Makoto Fujimura, who, if you didn't watch my previous episodes or listen, the first 2 books that I talked about were Art and Faith by Makoto Fujimura and Silence and Beauty, also by him. I'm not actually doing these in the order in which I read them, but this is one of the earlier ones in the sort of delineation that the Lord kind of brought to my attention. So I started reading this when I was still in North Carolina and right before I was transitioning to the city that I live in now. And so it was quite a time, quite a humbling time. And I think humility is one of the main things that is sort of like recurring in this particular book. And it's interesting because during that season of my life, which would have been the end of 2022, the beginning of 2023, was also when the Lord brought to my attention that I had been worshiping time because I had been so worked and riled and wound up about the timing of my life and what wasn't coming together and what I thought and all the things. And it was really just like, I remember a specific moment when the Lord spoke that to me, like, you have been worshiping time. And I was like, wow. And he's always right, you know what I mean? But I just started to see all the different ways that had been true. And something else that he kind of brought to my heart and attention was that my life would feel like a dance if I let it. So when I started this book, it was like those 2 ideas were being further confirmed, even just in the preface, because he starts by saying, in the preface, the very first sentence says, "This book is an invitation to the spiritual adventure we call time." And then further down he says, it's like living amid the cacophony of the modern world and finally discerning the beat of the spirit in history and knowing how to dance in time. And I think I just said that humility has been like one of the main things that I have learned, and not like I've arrived by any means, but that the Lord has worked in me, that I've come to see more value in, and also different ways that you can approach humility and implement humility that we might not readily think of as humility. One of the things that I've shared before is humor. For me, when I start to lose my sense of humor and take myself too seriously, that's also when I realize like I've been operating in pride. And like, when you have to have hard or sometimes awkward conversations, not to like take everything lightly or be like pejorative or self-deprecating, but sometimes rather than choosing to be or stay angry about something, you can let it just be comedic. You know what I'm saying? Because if it had happened on a movie or somebody else was telling you about it happening in their life, maybe like a couple months later, then you would laugh about it. But you can just choose to laugh about it sooner than that. Like, not to try to bypass the process of acknowledging and working through actual anger or actual sadness or actual heartbreak. You have to go through that, but you don't have to stay there. And what I've seen is that humor is one of the ways that the Lord helps me not stay there. So when it comes to this book specifically, on page 44, he says a couple of things that I feel like are pretty anchoring thoughts. So he says, there is an important difference between imagining history as a blank slate for our accomplishments and imagining it as a symphony we are asked to play a role in. And then later he talks about American history and this sort of hubris that is a hot mess. And he talks about our overestimating our capacity to manage history. And earlier in the book, in page 3, he's also kind of talking about how Christians in particular, and specifically like American Christians, have this tendency to operate with a temporal disorientation, which is not knowing when we are, right? And so he kind of starts by giving an example of like, a lot of times in movies, you might have a main character and they go through some traumatic thing and they wake up and they're like, where am I? But he's like, a lot of times we don't know when we are. And as y'all know, if you have followed me for any length of time, I concur. Like, we need to know when we are. We need to recognize the age that we live in and that we live in the last days. Now, how many last days will there be? I don't know, but all you have to do is look around to know that the time is very short. And so we need to be sober-minded about why we're here and what to do with our lives, and not just assume that like we get to have this sort of like comfortable, conventional existence, because a lot of us are not going to. And that doesn't have to be a tragedy, and it doesn't have to stay traumatic. You can work through the disappointment and the grief of that and connect with and align with God about what your actual calling is and why you're here now. So that's the encouragement that I have all the time, and that's one of the things that I pulled from this book, was just that humility of acknowledging when we are, and acknowledging time as being like so much bigger than us. And so this idea of know when is also something where people have a tendency to have like a delusion as if they are above or outside of time. I think I should probably read some of the phrases, because one of the things that I really liked about this book was just the fact that he was giving such rich such rich language to the way that I have experienced and thought about my own existence. So, I'm going to just read a little bit. He says, there is a kind of temporal dislocation akin to such unrecognized disorientation. So he's coming off this comparison of like, where am I? So it's like, when am I? And he says, I'm thinking of a kind of temporal disorientation that is unrecognized because it's buried and hidden by the illusion of being above the fray, immune to history, surfing time rather than being immersed and battered by its waves. Such temporal disorientation stems from the delusion of being know-when, unconditioned by time. And so you guys know I love a good surfing analogy. It's always just so fitting. So then he says, those who imagine they inhabit know-when imagine themselves wholly governed by timeless principles, unchanging convictions, expressing an idealism that assumes they are wholly governed by eternal ideas untainted by history. And then he says they live as if hatched rather than born. And you see this a lot with people who are self-righteous, but because they have divorced themselves from a lot of historical concepts of righteousness and what righteousness is, they probably would not think of themselves as self-righteous. But when I think of self-righteous, it's like I have all the right ideas, I have everything figured out, I have the strongest moral compass, and I'm navigating life basically perfectly. As perfectly as one can expect of a human. You know what I'm saying? And so it's like there's this unwillingness to acknowledge and recognize the extent to which the environment that you were born into and the time that you were born into has impacted and shaped who you are and how you think about everything. And I don't know why this example is coming to mind, but I'm just going to share it. Because I was thinking about stuff like, okay, this climate that we live in of conspiracy theories versus like science versus like intuition and observation, right? So you have some people who, for example, may not believe that the government is spraying toxic chemicals every day and like doing a bunch of intentionally nefarious things because they're like, there's no way they could do that. We can't modify the weather, even though all you have to do is like look up anything and it's been happening for decades. But those same people would be like, oh, but we definitely went to the moon in like 2 weeks and parachuted back down on the coast of California. And it's like, you know, and there's this sort of like haughtiness of like, I know how to navigate everything and I know what's lies and I know what's not lies. But it's like, even when it comes to something like the shape of the earth, right? Honestly, I personally don't feel like it's that deep. Like, but then I started to think about, like, why is there such a concerted effort to get people to believe one specific thing about whether the earth is flat or not, when at the same time, things that are very observable, and if you're thinking about science in its purest form, scientifically, this like believe the science, this, that, and the third, but when it comes to something like gender, like all of a sudden it's a spectrum, and all of a sudden we don't really have to regard the science about that because we're going to operate in what we decided is love and compassion. And it's like, once somebody tries to make everybody believe something, I start to wonder why you're so invested. Like, why do we have a culture where when it comes to God and existence itself, people are like, do what you want, believe what you want. But if anybody says, what if the earth is a different shape? Then all of a sudden the pitchforks come out. It's like, why are you so invested in that? And then I was reading in the Bible, and it talks about, like, I don't know why. Like I said, this is not something I normally care about, right? But I was noticing a couple verses that talk about the circle of the earth. And then I was thinking about how it can be, both things can be true. Like, you can have a flat surface that is a circle and a dome of firmament, and then you also can have a depth under the earth. And then it's like that reconciles all the different ways that the Bible talks about the earth and all the things that are actual science that are observable. But when you feel like you have to get the masses to believe this one thing, that makes me question it, because when is they ever trying to get people to believe one thing that is actually true, with the exception of the gospel, which the world hates? You know what I'm saying? So anyway, again, I don't know why I was giving that example, but I guess it's an example about, like, the time that we live in. Because when it comes to something like science as a life guiding post, which it was never really meant to be, people tend to forget that science has changed dramatically from century to century. So something like the Holocaust, as I've shared before, was promoted and justified using what society had agreed was the science, and what the state and government were funding as science, this idea of eugenics, this idea of, like, measuring people's skulls, and, like, all of this weird stuff that is not real science, and all of this, like, racial stuff that they're making up that is actually a social construct. And there are many things and many ways and many practices that we would now look at and be like, wow, that's entirely inhumane. But back then, it was, like, normalized. So you have to have the humility to recognize that you're not being impacted by the time and place in which you live. So in your search for truth, you have to be open to the fact that, I guess what I'm saying is, like, the Bible answers everything. And even if you don't understand all the specifics of it, the worldview itself and the narrative itself accommodates everything that you can observe. So if you are genuinely looking for truth, you can't start from a place where you've automatically discounted it without actually investigating it for yourself. And I was also thinking about, this is, I won't say hopefully, because if it's helpful, then it's helpful. This is also a side journey that I had not planned on talking about, but it's related, I think. If you think about a term like deconstruction, right? For one thing, all you have to do is look at the way people who start out sort of accepting basic foundational things without questioning everything tend to have a lot of beauty in their lives. They have a lot of normalcy in their lives. They might also have, like, hidden pain or grief or whatever, because they are human experiencing a human existence. But then they tend, in my observation, to sort of morph into, like, looking the same as everybody else who's quote unquote deconstructing. And I was thinking about that, and how, like, the term deconstruction presupposes that you're not going to have a structure at the end of it. You're going to have a pile of rubble. So even if you have questions, which I believe, like, you have to know what you believe and why you believe it. So if you want to call it deconstruction, whatever, but you could also think of it as reconstruction from the outset, because that presupposes that you're going to actually have a structure at the end, and that it will have a stronger foundation and be longer lasting. You'll have endurance. So I just wanted to encourage that, like, because we live in an age where there's so much information, but then there's also so many lies, and like you have to have something that you can trust and rely on. And I think that comes back to this thing about time and about this illusion or delusion really of being no win is like this similar thing. It's a parallel to agnosticism, or I don't know the technical term. I mean, there's depending on who you ask, right? But like it parallels this idea of like, I don't have to believe in anything. And it's like, no, you do. Like you believe in something, if nothing other than that you don't have to believe in anything. You know what I'm saying? So to come back to the book, I think that this is all related by way of humility, like I said before, but also because when J.K., what's his name? He's got a lot going on. James K.A. Smith, when he's talking about time and how it brings up our limitations, he's not just talking about time, he's talking about existence, you know? And so some of the things that he shared was like not resenting the fact that we are mortal, and that we are longer, than our lifetime. So, sorry, I have my notes here and I'm trying to stay focused, but maybe I should just follow the train where it's going. So, what I was thinking in terms of this humility and our limitations, and how it kind of relates to other things that I've been thinking lately, and also I think that I mentioned, I'm reading another book right now where there's overlapping ideas. And when it comes to like existence. And he actually, I've forgotten that he talked about this, but he shares a lot of the same things that I was thinking about recently that I shared in my episode called This Gift of Existence, where it's like when you start to think about existence, you start to realize how contingent existence is. So let me find where he talks about that. Page 31. He says, a feature of temporality that we either downplay or resist is the profound contingency of our existence. When we say something is contingent, we simply mean that it might not have been and doesn't have to be and could be otherwise. And that is true of the entirety of the created cosmos, brought into existence by the free act of a bountiful, loving God. All of creation might not have been. That doesn't make creation random or arbitrary, only contingent. And he also starts to talk about how like contingency is not a curse. So later, let me see, page 97, he says, contingency is not a curse. To live in resentment of creaturely finitude is its own form of pride. When we resent our own mortality, we resent the fact that what is given is not eternal. So I was actually thinking about how true this is, and how in my life, one of the major, I guess, like leaps in my personal refinement and discipleship with the Lord was this season where I was moving from California back to North Carolina. And I mentioned before I didn't want to, but I was doing that. And it was also a time when like Tumblr was still a thing before it got so dark and gross. And I used to like tumble all the time, right? And then I started to realize that so much of like, like if you know, you know, there was too much going on behind the scenes of Tumblr. I feel like it was like you would try to like curate this really nice page. And this was kind of before Pinterest like really took off too. I think they kind of had some overlap, but it's like you would try to curate a really nice vibe for yourself. And then all of a sudden there's like way too much, like basically almost porn over here, and then like witchcraft over, and you're like, what is happening? It's like no matter what, it's like finding its way. And then people had the craziest like screen names, and so I just had to get off of it, as I always end up just leaving. So anyway, during that season, and one of the things that I felt like was pulling me, that the Lord was wanting to sever, was nostalgia. And I remember the Lord kind of like teaching me and communicating to me that like nostalgia is not your friend. And I really had to sit with that, because as an artist, as a folk artist in particular, I feel like myself and other folk artists have a tendency to be hypersensitive to the impermanence of things. And we also feel like compelled to like capture and honor the essence of specific places in particular times. And so I kind of had to realize that there's a healthy way to do that, and having a healthy reverence for the brevity of life, rather than always like letting myself get caught up in nostalgia, which sort of like drags you back and can sort of like, for one thing, it's like you're not being thankful. Like, it's not enough that you lived through it and enjoyed it, right? It's like you don't want to let it go. And it's like you're finding way too much comfort in what used to be. And so that's like one of the things that I was thinking about when he's talking about, how was I thinking about that? Oh, this sort of like creaturely finitude, and that what was given is not eternal. And so when you have a healthy reverence for the brevity of your life, of other people's lives, it's supposed to, for one thing, spur us to look to the creator of life, and for another, make the most of our lives and find out what are we supposed to be doing. So anyway, this other book that I've been reading, I think there's probably more to that I might come back around to, but I don't want to just be rambling. So the other book that I've been reading is Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. And y'all, this photo just makes me laugh out loud all the time. And the more you read him and you see his, like, you get a sense of his personality, it just makes it all the more hilarious. He's just got such a spitfire personality. But anyway, I was reading this, and I recommend it. It's a really good read, and a lot of what he's saying gives language to like what we can look around and experience in society right now. And it's interesting because it's like G.K. Chesterton, A.W. Tozer, and C.S. Lewis have been really influential writers and thinkers in my life, and I feel like so much of what they saw in society and wrote about has only like become more true and more evident now. And so that's kind of what I mean when I was talking previously about seers kind of having this higher perspective to see where things are going. It's not always some spectacular thing where like God's giving you a vision, and like sometimes it's just the way he put you together to where you are compelled to pay attention to these kinds of things, and you also feel compelled to speak about them. And that does kind of come back to this time component, because you only exist in a certain period of time, in a sense, you know what I'm saying? So anyway, on page 18, G.K. Chesterton was saying, he's talking about basically how modern thinkers have a tendency, again, out of like hubris, arrogance, and this sort of sense of no-win, like they're coming up with all this stuff for the first time and nobody's ever thought this and that and the third before, but they end up being very circular. You know, it's similar to like the horseshoe theory political, where it's like if you go so far in one direction, you're going to end up in the other direction. And both of these are really, really good. And when I say they're really, really good, I mean like these phrases that pop out have so much rich context that's worth reading around them, that I really do recommend that you read both of these books. So Orthodoxy and then How to Inhabit Time. But he says, the peril is that the human intellect is free to destroy itself. Just as one generation could prevent the very existence of the next generation by all entering a monastery or jumping into the sea, so one set of thinkers can in some degree prevent further thinking by teaching the next generation that there is no validity in any human thought. And so the way that that connects to what James is talking about, is similar. It's this idea of contingency and of recognizing that you weren't spurned, you weren't just hatched, you were born into a legacy of human history, and that, again, we are longer than our lifetime. And when he says that phrase, he's actually bringing in this biblical example of how, like, Moses had a role and an assignment, and then Joshua was the one that actually ended up bringing the people of Israel into the promised land, in part because of Moses' disobedience that one time when he crashed out, and the Lord was like, now I have to, like, the Lord, as much as he wanted to well, I don't have to go on into that. That's what happened. Moses crashed out and then he wasn't able to go to the promised land. But so Joshua had to do it. But it's like Joshua was born into something that was already in process. And so he had to operate within those limitations, but also within the privilege of his particular existence. Okay, which I guess can bring me to the next thing, because I don't want to get... I feel like I can probably just bring it home here soon. So, one other thing that I thought was worth chatting about, well, two other things. I'm going to go into this aspect of relationships, though. So I think another thing that I pulled from this book in particular, because I went back to like look at what I had highlighted and some notes, and I was like, I need to just read this whole thing all over again. It's so good. But I didn't do that yet. But I was noticing that he was talking a lot about time and relationships. And I was thinking about that recently because I would still like to get married. And I was thinking about how, like, assuming I marry somebody that's like close to my same age, we will have like close to 80 years of life lived between us. And that's a lot of lore. It's a lot to unpack. And I was thinking about that just because I think a lot and I pray a lot. And I was thinking about how, like, the older you get, the more of the things that you would develop in covenant with somebody in marriage, you have to exercise in order to actually enter the covenant and get started. And by that, I mean, like, there's a lot, when you're older, you already have your own thing going, and you really have to submit to one another in love if you're gonna, like, make a life together. Obviously, there's a sense in which, like, if you're not compatible, then you're not compatible. But even simple things like your daily routine or what you like to do on a holiday or whatever, like, you're so much more established in your own deal when you're older than if you get married, like, when you're way younger. Some people have really intense childhoods, and so I'm not discounting that. But if you get married when you're like 20, you've basically just been in school for your whole life. You know what I mean? And you start your life together, and it has its own unique challenges, but that's different than being like, I was scared to cuss, almost 40 and like having lived through, like, if I think about the last 7 years of my life, there's so much that happened in so many ways that the Lord has changed and refined me in that last 7 years, that if I got married when I was 30, it's like an exponential compounding thing almost. But anyway, so in thinking about times and relationships, he's talking about, well, let me just read some of this. Well, okay. One of the things that made me think that of those things as connected to what he's talking about is that I'll just read it. So he says, like, if you want to transcend time, then you can build friendships across generations, right? So you can be friends with people who have been around a lot longer than you have, as well as people who have been around for a lot less time than you have, because they have been shaped by a different society, especially these days, right? And one of the most beautiful ways, in my opinion, obviously, like, natural family, that happens, but also the church. Like, when you're in a healthy church, then a lot of times it will be multi-generational, and you can have healthy friendships with the children in the church and the older people in the church, and you can listen to the children tell you what it's like for them to be children in this time that we live in now, and you can learn from people who remember things before you got here, that those who orchestrate the societies that we live in, that, you know, God allows to be in positions of power to ultimately enact his will and purposes, a lot of times there are things that they don't want us to remember. Like, let's go back to the sky, right? I was talking to one of my sisters the other day about this, about how, like, at one point in time, they were actually educating us. And so some of us who get most riled up about what's going on in the sky are like, no, because we learned the cloud types. We had to know the different types of clouds, and these are not it. You know what I mean? And so it's like, when you have these multi-generational relationships and you respect and honor one another, then that's such an important asset, especially the more time progresses, because there are more, there's a greater intensity coming against that. So anyway, he says, if we can relinquish the myth of utter singularity, then listening to those generations ahead of us is a way of learning from our future. Granted, it is in the nature of youth to spurn such gifts, but when we are humbled, friendship across generation becomes a lifeline and almost sacramental means of transcending the purview of our now, as God gives us an outside glimpse of our moment. And then he talks about how it can go both ways, like I was just sharing. And he said he was a professor of undergraduates, and he felt like every classroom is a time machine. And then he talks about like when you... Okay. He says, you might look at the life of an older friend, which seems intentional and grounded and placid, and you might imagine that it was a straight path. But when you look at such a lifetime from the mire in which you might find yourself, overwhelmed, failing, and flailing, it's easy to be given to both despair and envy. But then, in a conversation, presumably with this older friend, you discover they've lived through past seasons that you didn't see. And I just think that that's such an important thing to remember, and part of why we should not judge people, because we don't know what they've lived through or where they're going. You know what I'm saying? So, anyway, I have a lot of thoughts about that, obviously. The last thing that I will say, though, is that this book was one of the things that helped me recognize the intentionality of God in weaving endurance as like the motif of my story. And that has been really like orienting for me and really grounding for me, and something that I continually come back to. And obviously it has been something that helped me have the clarity to contextualize my podcast, and also contextualize what I'm trying to accomplish with my podcast, which is to help people keep going. Because that is what, like, we have to keep going. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't quit. You don't want to quit on yourself. You don't want to quit on God. And it takes faith to keep going, but it also takes skill and encouragement. And those are things that we can learn and glean from one another. And so then lastly, there was just another thought, another phrase that I appreciated, which was when it comes to, recognizing God's providence in our lives, similar to what he was sharing about, like, when you get to know somebody and you realize what they've actually lived through, and especially if they don't look like what they've been through, as they say, then you start to realize that these are things not only to learn, but to carry. So it's like, you don't want to just be like, oh, that's a good point, and then just like let it, flee your memory. You want to live carrying this recognition and knowledge of when you are, but also how time is, and the spiritual environment that time creates, to exercise humility and to rely on the Lord, because he is outside of time, and he's the one that establishes our times and our seasons. And so just one last phrase that he had was this sort of practical eschatology, is what he called it, is the lived wisdom of knowing when we are. And so again, that is true not only for like the set of years that you are born into, because none of us know when we get here what that finite set is going to be, but also recognizing internal seasons, like, what season am I in right now? What do I need to let go of? What is the Lord trying to prune? Because I think a good thing to kind of just check with the Lord about is if you find that years of your life are going by and you haven't given up anything. You know what I mean? Like, the Lord, like, you don't feel like the Lord has asked you to give up anything that you really like you're basically doing all the same things, and you are kind of the same person. You want to check in with him, because the truth of the matter is that the Bible says that the Lord prunes us when we're bearing good fruit, and if we're not bearing any fruit, we get pruned either way. And so you just want to know what season you're in. Like, do I need to let this go? Whether that's like for me, I used to be such a huge Moana fan, right? I thought it was such a good movie, and it helped me in that season. And if you look at some of the OG Turf Shack videos, there's like a little picture of Moana that I had in my apartment. Well, even before all of the Disney craziness that was finally confirmed, I just started to feel like I didn't need that anymore. Like, I needed to let that go, and that I needed to not wrap any tiny bit of my identity in this story of Moana. Like, it was a good story and the Lord helped me through it and it was fun, and then it was like, okay, like, it's time to move on. But I feel like, again, this sort of nostalgia thing, I feel like has a grip on our generation to where people are still reading and watching all the same stuff that was questionable to begin with, and you make it your whole personality, and there's no room for God to develop you into who he wants you to be. So this was exciting. I will be back to chat to you soon. I hope you guys got something good out of it. And the next book that I think I'm going to be talking about is called Apostles and Prophets. So I'll be back to chat to you soon. Okay, bye.